Steve had learned to read winter the way other people read a calendar. The day after a hard blizzard, the forest sounded different, as if the trees were holding their breath. Snow packed the porch steps, the yard fence looked half buried, and the air bit at any skin that showed. He ate quickly, pulled on his thick wool socks, then his insulated boots. A faded jacket went over a flannel shirt, and he cinched the scarf tight at his neck. Before he stepped out, he checked the stove, because a cold house at night could turn a small mistake into a real problem. Outside, the sky was pale and flat, the kind of light that made everything look farther away than it was. Steve lifted his axe and a saw from the rack, balanced the empty sled rope over his shoulder, and walked toward the tree line. The snow was deep enough that every step fought him, and the wind still pushed loose powder off the drifts in slow waves. The storm had broken branches all over the lower slope. That was the one small mercy after nights like this, because fallen wood meant he did not have to cut into living trees. He followed an old track between spruce trunks, reading the shallow dents from deer and the sharper, lighter prints of something smaller. He chose a downed fir with dry limbs, chopped what he could with steady swings, then switched to the saw when the wood thickened. The work warmed his chest and shoulders, but his fingers still went numb whenever he paused. Snow dusted his eyelashes, melted, then froze again when he blinked. By late morning the sled was half full. Steve tightened the rope, pulled the load toward home, then stopped at the edge of a small clearing to catch his breath. The silence out there felt heavy, but it was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that reminded him how far a man could be from help if something went bad. He dumped the first load by the woodpile and went back out. The second trip was slower. The snow had settled, making a crust that sometimes held and sometimes broke, and his legs started to shake with the effort. He kept his pace even, because rushing in cold weather was how people got hurt. The afternoon stretched long. The sun never truly showed itself, just shifted behind thin cloud. Steve cut 2 more lengths, tied them down, and hauled them in. His breath steamed into his scarf, and his back ached in a way that felt deep, as if the ache had its own weight. When he finally turned toward home for good, he expected the familiar sight of smoke from his chimney and the comfort of his porch railing poking out of the snow. Instead, he heard something that did not belong in the quiet. It was a sound that rose and broke, then rose again, not a bark, not a howl, but a strained, rough cry that seemed to scrape the cold air. Steve stopped in the trees and listened. The sound came again, and this time he could tell it was close. It was not out in the forest behind him. It was ahead, toward the house. He dropped the sled rope and moved faster, still careful on the crusted snow. The cry turned into short, desperate noises, then fell silent, as if whoever made it had run out of strength. Steve's heartbeat thudded in his ears as he crossed the yard. On the porch, at the edge of the doormat that was almost buried, a shape lay stretched on its side. At first his mind refused to name it. The spotted coat blended with snow shadow and weathered boards, and the tufted ears were pressed back. Then the animal's ribs lifted, barely, and Steve felt his stomach tighten. It was a lynx. The cat was larger than most people expected, broad through the shoulders, legs long, paws wide like snowshoes. Frost clung to the whiskers and the fur around the muzzle. One flank was damp where snow had melted against body heat, then turned to crust. Steve took one slow step closer, keeping his hands low and his body turned slightly aside. He watched for the snap of teeth or the sudden spring of muscle. Nothing happened. The lynx's chest rose again, faintly, and a weak shiver ran through its back leg. The porch boards creaked under Steve's boot, and he froze, giving the lynx a chance to react. A healthy cat would have exploded off the planks at that sound, vanished in a single bound. This one only twitched an ear and let out a breath that sounded like a dry rattle. Steve scanned the snow. No fresh blood, no snapped twig trail, only a faint drag mark that ended right at the step. Whatever had happened, the lynx had spent its last strength getting here. He crouched at arm's length, careful not to crowd the animal's head. Up close he could see ice beads in the fur between the toes, and the pads looked raw from crusted snow. The lynx's belly moved with each breath in small, uneven pulls. Its throat worked as if swallowing was hard. A gust pushed loose powder across the porch and over the lynx's back like a sheet. The animal did not flinch. Its chest rose once, then paused a beat too long, and Steve felt that pause like a warning. He kept his body turned slightly sideways, the way he did around nervous animals, so he would not look like a threat. With his free hand he brushed snow away from the lynx's flank without touching fur, searching for a wound or a snare cut. He found none, only stiff, cold coat and a tremor that ran through the muscles like the animal was fighting sleep. Steve leaned closer and listened. The breathing was there, but shallow, and every few pulls sounded like the air had to squeeze past something tight in the chest. He had always followed one rule with wildlife out here. Do not interfere unless you are sure leaving it alone means it will die. Another weak breath came, thinner than the last. The lynx's mouth opened a fraction, and a small sound slipped out, as if it was trying to call and could not. Steve exhaled into his scarf, and made the decision he had been resisting since the first moment he recognized the cat. He stepped closer, reached out with his gloved hand, and hovered above the lynx's shoulder without touching, watching for any sign of strength. The lynx did not move. Steve's fingers tightened inside the gloves, not from fear alone, but from the cold and the weight of the choice in front of him. It lay on his doorstep, barely breathing, as if the storm had carried it there and dropped it at the only place that still held warmth. Steve stayed crouched on the porch longer than made sense if he had been thinking only about himself. The cold crept through his boots, up his legs, and into his lower back, but he did not rush. A wild animal did not forgive sudden movement, even when it was weak. He watched the lynx breathe. Each rise of the ribs was shallow, uneven, as if the lungs were working against something heavy. The cat smelled of wet fur and cold iron, the sharp scent animals carried after long stress. Steve kept his face turned slightly away, letting the lynx see his outline without feeling stared at. He knew the rules he had lived by for years. A wild animal was not a lost dog. You did not touch it unless you had no other option. You did not bring it inside unless leaving it outside meant certain death. And you never forgot that even dying animals could still bite. Steve looked at the sky. The light was already thinning, and the temperature would drop fast once the sun was fully gone. The porch boards were cold enough to pull heat straight out of anything lying on them. He imagined what another hour out here would do to lungs already struggling. The lynx's head shifted slightly, then fell back. A low sound slipped from its throat, not a growl, not a warning, just breath forced through tight muscles. Steve felt his jaw tighten. Waiting was no longer neutral. Waiting was choosing. He stood slowly, keeping his movements wide and visible. He went inside first, opened the door all the way, and shoved it back so it would not swing. Warm air spilled out and vanished into the cold. He cleared the space just inside the entry, dragging a thick mat and an old blanket away from the stove, far enough that sparks could not reach. He came back out and stopped again at arm's length from the lynx. He bent his knees and tested the weight by sliding his hands under the animal's chest and hips without lifting. The lynx reacted only with a faint twitch, claws barely flexing against frozen boards. Steve breathed out and committed. He lifted carefully, keeping the lynx's head angled away from his face, using his legs more than his arms. The body was heavier than it looked, dense with muscle even now. For a second the lynx's eyes opened, glassy and unfocused, and fixed on his shoulder. Steve froze, holding the weight steady. Nothing followed. The eyes closed again, and the tension drained as if the animal had no strength left to spend on fear. Steve stepped backward into the house, one slow step at a time, until the doorframe brushed his shoulder. He eased the lynx down onto the cleared spot, guiding it onto its side. Only when the body was fully supported did he let go. He closed the door with his foot, sealing the cold out. The sudden quiet inside felt wrong, like the air itself was waiting to see if he had made a mistake. The lynx lay still, chest moving in short pulls. Its paws were ice cold through the fur. Steve knelt nearby but not close, watching for any sign of panic. He fed a little more wood into the stove, careful not to let the room heat too fast. Shock did strange things to animals, and he did not want to trade cold for stress. He filled a shallow metal pan with water and set it a short distance away, far enough that the lynx would have to choose to reach it. He did not try to touch the mouth or force anything. If the cat drank, it would be on its own terms. Minutes passed. The lynx shifted once, claws scraping softly against the floor. Its breathing steadied just enough that Steve could hear a rhythm forming. He allowed himself one deeper breath, and then noticed something that had not been clear on the porch. Beneath the thick winter coat, along the lynx's side, there was movement that did not match breathing. It was slow, rolling, then gone. Steve leaned closer, still careful to stay out of reach. He watched again. Another subtle push passed under the fur, low along the belly, followed by a tightening that made the skin draw inward. His stomach dropped. This was not just exhaustion. This was not just cold. Steve straightened slowly, eyes never leaving the lynx. He had seen enough wildlife in trouble to know the signs when they finally lined up. The weight, the shape, the way the body carried itself even now. The lynx was pregnant. As if to confirm it, the animal drew in a deeper breath and let it out with a strained sound that was sharper than before. Its back legs stretched, then pulled in again, muscles tightening on their own. Steve stayed still, heart beating hard in his chest. He had brought a wild predator into his home to keep it alive for the night. Now he understood that what lay on his floor was not one life, but several, balanced on a narrow edge between warmth and cold. The room had warmed, but the air felt tight, as if it could not quite move the way it should. Steve stayed where he was, near the wall, his back against the wood, giving the lynx space. He resisted the urge to pace. Movement meant pressure, and pressure could turn into panic. The lynx shifted again. This time it was not a small adjustment. Its back legs drew in toward the belly, then pushed out, slow and deliberate. A low sound left its throat, deeper than before, rough with effort. Steve recognized it at once, even though he had never seen a lynx give birth. This was labor. He did not step closer. He did not reach for tools or cloth the way a person might with a domestic animal. He knew enough to understand his role was smaller than his instinct wanted it to be. Warmth, quiet, and distance. Anything more could make things worse. The lynx's breathing changed. It came in short pulls, then paused, then rushed out again. The muscles along its sides tightened so sharply that the fur rippled. Its ears flattened, and the tail flicked once against the floor. Steve eased the stove damper just a fraction, careful not to spike the heat. He dimmed the single light overhead until the room fell into a softer glow. Shadows settled along the walls, and the space felt less exposed. Another sound came, sharper this time, followed by a tremor that ran through the lynx's body. Its front paws dug against the blanket, claws catching and releasing. Steve swallowed and forced himself to stay still. His presence was already a risk. Interference would only add another. Time stretched in a way that made minutes feel heavy. The lynx strained again, breath hitching, then pushing through. Steve watched the rise and fall of the belly, the tight curve of muscle, the way the animal gathered itself and bore down. Then something changed. A small, dark shape slipped free against the blanket. For a moment it did not move, only lay there, slick and still. Steve's chest tightened as if the air had left the room entirely. The lynx turned its head, slow but precise, and drew the small body closer with a careful hook of its foreleg. It lowered its muzzle and began to lick, rough tongue working with steady focus. The tiny shape twitched, then made a thin, reedy sound that cut through the quiet. Steve released a breath he had not realized he was holding. The first cub was alive. He shifted his weight without stepping closer, adjusting his view just enough to see the movement. The cub was impossibly small, fur dark and matted, limbs tucked close. The lynx's attention never left it, eyes sharp now despite the strain. Steve thought it was over. He was wrong. The lynx's body tightened again, harder than before. Its breathing went uneven, faster, then staggered. A sound left its throat that made Steve's hands curl into fists at his sides. The effort took more than the last push, more than the strength it had shown so far. The lynx paused, sides heaving. For several seconds it did nothing at all. Steve leaned forward a fraction, then stopped himself. He could not help by being closer. He could only make space. Another contraction rolled through the animal, sharper, more urgent. The lynx bore down again, jaw clenched, teeth flashing white in the dim light. Its back legs trembled, then locked. The second cub came harder. It slipped free and landed awkwardly against the blanket, half turned. For a heartbeat it lay still, too still, and Steve felt a cold pressure settle behind his ribs. The lynx reached for it at once, pulling it close, licking with frantic intensity. The seconds dragged. Steve counted them without meaning to, each one loud in his head. Then the cub moved. A weak wriggle, a thin sound, barely more than breath, but enough. The lynx's shoulders sagged as if something inside it finally gave way. It gathered both cubs against its chest, curling around them with the last of its strength. Steve stayed where he was, barely breathing himself now. The lynx's sides rose and fell, but not evenly. Each breath came shallow, sometimes too quick, sometimes delayed just long enough to make him tense. The room was quiet except for that uneven breathing and the faint sounds of the cubs pressed against their mother. Steve watched the lynx's chest, counting rises, waiting for the rhythm to settle. It did not. The lynx lay still, eyes half closed, body wrapped around its cubs, breathing thin and irregular, as if it had pushed itself past a line it could not easily step back from. Night settled slowly, as if it had weight. The light outside the windows thinned until the glass turned black, and the house seemed to shrink inward around the small circle of warmth near the stove. Steve stayed awake, sitting on a low chair by the wall, his jacket still on, his boots unlaced but not removed. He watched without staring. Every few minutes his eyes returned to the lynx, tracing the rise and fall of her chest. The rhythm was still wrong. Too shallow, then too fast, then a pause that stretched longer than comfort allowed. Each pause made Steve's shoulders tighten before the next breath came. He fed the stove carefully, one piece of wood at a time. Too much heat would dry the air and stress her lungs. Too little, and the cold would creep back in. He adjusted the damper by small degrees, listening to the fire respond, learning the balance by sound. A shallow metal dish of water sat within reach of the lynx, but not close enough to force contact. The surface trembled now and then when her body shifted. Once, she lifted her head a few inches, nostrils flaring, then let it fall back down without drinking. The cubs stayed pressed against her belly, blind and silent most of the time. When they moved, it was in small, searching motions, tiny paws kneading instinctively. Their faint sounds barely reached the far wall, but Steve heard every one. He did not touch them. That choice stayed sharp in his mind through the long hours. Every instinct told him to do more, to check, to adjust, to make sure they were warm enough. Experience told him that his scent, his hands, his closeness could break something fragile that did not need breaking. He shifted his weight only when his legs went numb, moving slowly, keeping his outline predictable. Each time the floor creaked, the lynx's ear flicked. Her eyes opened briefly, catching the low light, then closed again. At some point after midnight, Steve cut a few thin strips of raw meat and placed them on a flat pan, sliding it closer with the end of a broom handle. He stayed back, heart pounding harder than it had during the birth. The lynx did not react at first. Minutes passed. The fire popped softly. Then the lynx's head lifted again, higher this time. She sniffed the air, muscles along her neck tightening. Slowly, carefully, she stretched her muzzle forward and took one piece between her teeth. Steve held his breath. She chewed with effort, jaws working in short motions, then swallowed. After a pause, she took another piece. When she was done, she lay back down, sides heaving, but the breathing sounded a fraction deeper than before. Steve leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for the first time all night. Sleep never fully came. It hovered at the edge of his thoughts, broken by every sound. The scrape of claws, the shift of fur, the soft, thin movements of the cubs. Outside, the wind dropped. Snow slid from branches with dull thumps. The house settled, wood contracting in the cold. Steve marked time by the stove and by the sky slowly lightening beyond the window. Just before dawn, the lynx moved again. This time it was different. She gathered her legs beneath her, pushing her chest up off the floor. The movement was slow and unsteady, but it was deliberate. Steve's pulse jumped. She paused halfway, breathing hard, then pushed again. Her back legs trembled, then straightened. For a moment she stood hunched, head low, tail loose, body swaying slightly. Steve did not move. He did not speak. He let the space between them stay wide and clear. The lynx steadied herself and turned her head, checking the cubs where they lay against the blanket. One paw reached back, pulling them closer. She lowered herself again, but not all the way. She stayed upright on her chest, alert now, eyes open and watching the room. The night was ending. Steve felt it in the air, in the way her posture had changed. She was still weak, but she was no longer drifting. Whatever line she had crossed during the night, she was now climbing back from it. Morning brought a thin, gray light that slipped across the floor and settled against the walls. Steve stood and stretched slowly, easing stiffness from his legs, careful not to draw attention. The lynx watched him now. Her eyes were clear, tracking without panic, measuring. She was no longer drifting. The weakness that had flattened her during the night had pulled back, not gone, but controlled. When she shifted her weight, it was with intent. When she breathed, it was deeper, steadier. The cubs moved more often. Small bodies pressed and unpressed against her belly, paws flexing, mouths searching. Their sounds were stronger than before, thin but certain. Steve noticed how the lynx adjusted automatically, pulling them closer, angling her body to block drafts. He began to prepare without approaching her. Steve moved through the house slowly, lifting and carrying anything that could turn into noise or clutter. A bucket was set against the wall. Loose tools were slid into a corner. He rolled up a rug that creaked when stepped on and leaned it outside the room. He opened the inner door a crack to let cooler air balance the heat. The fire stayed low, steady, just enough to keep warmth without drying the room. He did not want the house to feel like a trap. The lynx stood again. This time she rose more cleanly, legs bracing, shoulders lifting without the heavy sway from before. She took one careful step, then another, circling the small space near the stove. Her head stayed low, ears turning, reading the room. Steve remained still, hands open at his sides. He focused on his breathing, keeping it slow and even. The lynx stopped and looked toward the door. Not directly at it. Toward the seam where light slipped in. She sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, then took a step closer. Her tail lifted slightly, then lowered again. One paw touched the floor near the door, claws clicking softly against wood. Steve felt the shift before he fully understood it. This was no longer about surviving the night. This was about leaving. He moved away from the door, increasing the distance instead of closing it. With slow, deliberate steps, he crossed the room and pulled the door open wider. Cold air flowed in, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of snow and forest. The lynx froze at the change, muscles tensing. Her eyes locked on the opening, then flicked to Steve, then back again. She stood that way for a long moment, weighing. Steve stopped moving entirely. After a while, she approached the doorway, body low, shoulders rolling with each step. She did not rush. She tested the air with short breaths, then retreated half a step, returning to the cubs. She gathered them closer, curling around them once more. Her head stayed lifted, eyes on the door. Steve understood the message clearly. Not yet. He backed away and went outside, clearing the porch quietly. Snow had drifted back in overnight, softening edges. He brushed it aside, widening the path without scraping. He stepped down and packed a narrow trail toward the yard, just enough to show a direction, not enough to draw attention. When he returned inside, the lynx was standing again. She paced once, twice, then stopped near the door. One paw lifted, hovered, then set down against the threshold. Her breathing quickened, not from weakness, but from decision. The cubs shifted as she moved, small sounds rising and falling. She bent and took one gently by the scruff, lifting with care. The cub dangled, limp and trusting, instinct overriding fear. Steve's chest tightened. She set the cub down, adjusted her grip, then lifted it again, testing. Her head turned back toward the room, scanning, then returned to the door. The lynx was no longer resting. She was choosing. Steve stood to the side of the doorway and waited. He did not rush the moment, did not fill it with movement or sound. The door stayed open, wide enough to show the path but not so wide that it felt like a shove. Cold air slid across the floor in a thin sheet. It carried the clean smell of snow and pine, sharper than the warmer air inside. The lynx lifted her head and breathed it in, long and slow. Her ears turned forward, then back, testing every sound beyond the threshold. She moved first without looking at him. One careful step brought her to the door. Her paws touched the threshold and paused, weight shifting as she judged the height, the texture, the drop beyond. Steve stayed still, eyes lowered, body turned slightly away. He made himself part of the wall, not the decision. The lynx leaned forward, nose close to the open air, then drew back again. She returned to the cubs, circled them once, then lowered her head and took one gently by the scruff. The cub went still at once, legs tucked, a small sound slipping out and fading. She carried it to the doorway and set it down just outside. The cub lay in the snow for a breath, dark against white, then wriggled weakly. The lynx turned back immediately and took the second cub, repeating the movement with the same care. Steve felt his hands tighten and forced them to relax. With both cubs placed outside, the lynx stepped onto the porch fully for the first time. Her body looked different in the daylight, leaner than it had seemed inside, muscles defined under thick winter fur. She paused again, checking the yard, the tree line, the wind. She did not hurry. She gathered the first cub again, then the second, adjusting her grip until both were secure. Snow clung to her whiskers as she stepped down from the porch and followed the narrow packed path Steve had made earlier. Each step was deliberate, weight controlled, no wasted motion. At the edge of the yard she stopped and turned her head. For a moment Steve thought she might look back at him. Instead, she scanned the house, the open door, the quiet room beyond. Her ears flicked once, then settled. She crossed into the trees. The forest swallowed her almost at once. Branches closed, shadows layered over spots, and the lynx became pattern instead of shape. The last thing Steve saw was the slow, steady lift of her tail as she moved uphill, cubs held close. He waited until the sounds were gone. Only then did he step forward and close the door. The click of the latch sounded loud in the empty room. He stood there for a long moment, breathing, letting the house cool back into itself. He cleaned quietly. The blanket was folded and set aside. The water pan was emptied. He did not scrub or erase everything, only enough to return the space to normal use. Some things were better left unexamined. That night, the house felt larger than before. Sleep came in short pieces. Each time he woke, he listened for sounds that did not come. The stove ticked as it cooled. The wind moved through the trees. Nothing else. In the morning, Steve stepped outside before the sun cleared the ridge. The snow had crusted overnight, holding shape. He walked the edge of the porch and saw the prints immediately. Wide paws. Light impressions where weight had shifted to protect what was carried. The tracks led away from the house, but not far. They curved along the edge of the yard, dipped toward a stand of young trees, then angled back toward the slope behind the house. Steve followed them with his eyes, not his feet. The lynx had passed close enough to circle once before choosing her direction. Then the tracks stretched out, stride lengthening, confidence returning. They disappeared into the forest, leaving only quiet and a narrow story pressed into snow. The days that followed did not announce themselves. They arrived quietly, one after another, marked only by small changes in light and temperature. Steve went back to his routines because routines were how life stitched itself together again. He split wood in the mornings, steady and methodical, letting the rhythm settle his thoughts. The snow softened at midday and hardened again by evening. Each night, The house held its warmth without effort, the stove doing its work as it always had. He checked the yard without searching it. At first, the tracks were still there, pressed into the crust, softened at the edges. He saw them each morning as he stepped outside. Then one day, the wind shifted, and new snow fell thin and dry. The lines blurred. The story in the snow broke apart. By the fourth morning, there was nothing left to follow. Steve noticed other signs instead. A grouse feather near the tree line. A set of hair prints crossing the slope behind the house. Life moving, unremarkable and complete in its own way. He did not talk about what had happened. There was no one to tell, and no need. The house held no trace that mattered. The floor was clean. The air smelled only of wood smoke and cold. Once, while carrying another load of split logs, he stopped at the edge of the porch and looked toward the trees. He did not expect to see her. Expectation would have been a kind of claim. What he felt instead was something quieter. He thought about the moment he had stepped aside and opened the door. How little he had actually done with his hands. How much had depended on knowing when not to interfere. He understood now that help was not measured by how long something stayed with you. That understanding settled deep, without ceremony. The forest kept its distance. No cries returned in the night. No shadows paused at the edge of the yard. The space between house and trees returned to what it had always been, a line that could be crossed but should not be erased. Steve repaired a loose board on the porch, hammered it back into place, and brushed away the last of the old snow. The work was simple. It felt right. One afternoon, a few days later, he found a set of faint impressions near the far boundary of his land. They were already soft, half taken by sun and wind, but he recognized the shape. Not close. Not lingering. Just passing through. He did not follow them. He stood where he was and watched the trees move with the breeze. The impressions faded even as he looked at them, losing definition, returning to the ground. Steve went back inside and closed the door, not as a barrier, but as a habit. The house warmed again, familiar and solid. Outside, the forest went on. What had happened there was finished. He had not saved a family. He had not changed the wild. He had done something smaller and harder to define. He had made room. And sometimes, Steve knew that was enough.
Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories. And now just click the playlist or the next video on your screen.